Kapila is a professor of humanitarian affairs at the University of Manchester and a senior advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly for the Mediterranean. He joins us live from Geneva, Switzerland for more. Mukesh, always good to see you. So there's been lots of talk of war crimes, crimes against humanity, even genocide over the last few days as these unspeakably violent pictures emerge from places where the Russian army has vacated. How difficult is that, though, to prove in a court, ultimately, when this makes its way there? Because you have Russia saying, you know, they're making their own claims on these things.
I think the crime itself is not that difficult to prove. After all, you've seen the images, you've seen the witness accounts. And for me, what I was seeing on the images and reports is very similar to what I saw when I went to Srebrenica myself all those years ago. See, the question is about intent. Are these field actions by out-of-order local soldiers, or is there a command and control instruction from the leaders of this, obviously on the Russian side? And that to prove in a court of law will take time. But it doesn't really matter. The fact that a war crime has been committed, which is also a crime against humanity, does indeed at least lead to the conclusion that something very wrong has happened. It's a question of who to hold accountable. That'll be what the legal problem is going to be in the end.
Right. I mean, even targeting of things like hospitals and schools and civilian areas that we have clearly seen would constitute a war crime under the conventions. However, when you have civilians also armed, and the Russian Defense Ministry, for example, can say, well, everybody around that hospital was armed, and there were people shooting from a window. Does that muddy things? Does that make it that much more difficult to ultimately prove?
Well, certainly it muddies things, and obviously those who have been accused of such crimes are obviously going to do everything possible to muddy the understanding. However, what is very difficult to dispute is that crimes have taken place, where civilians have been attacked. And regardless of the confusion of a war, and there's always confusion in a war, combatants are under duty to ensure that their response in a conflict, in a war, is proportionate. So I don't think this would be a defense in terms of justifying what has happened.
Sure.
The problem is really to identify the tactical commanders and the strategic commanders who, in a sense, orchestrated this or gave the orders to enable this to happen. But we have this thing going on in the International Criminal Court just now about a field commander from Darfur who's in front of the International Criminal Court. And there are very similar circumstances in terms of some of the judicial issues that are involved.
Yeah, exactly. Let's listen to some of what the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg just said on this subject of the brutality that we're seeing.
We have all seen the horrific images of murdered civilians in Bucha and other places controlled by the Russian military until a few days ago. This is unbearable brutality that Europe has not witnessed in many decades. Targeting and murdering civilians is a war crime.
And Mukesh, we've heard even world leaders at times brand some of what we've seen. And it is true that we're seeing things without proof necessarily, proof that would ultimately have to stand up in a court. But they've called it outright genocide. If you could briefly for us, break it down. What are obvious war crimes that, of course, later have to be proved? And what constitutes genocide?
Right. War crimes are what we're seeing now in terms of the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and commissioning acts of atrocity against individuals and groups, be they soldiers or civilians. Now, if the intent behind those acts is to eliminate a group on account of their identity, then that would meet the criteria of a genocidal act. And the question is that in this situation in Bucha, whether what the Russian warriors were trying to do was an intent to eliminate, or were they simply doing horrible things, which I'm afraid there has been a lot of that in this particular conflict. Now, looking at the pattern of what's going on, it would seem that if it is a common occurrence, and there is reports of that around Ukraine, then that points towards a command and control. And that's one of the important aspects of a genocide, to demonstrate command and control. And final point on this is to distinguish between a genocidal act in one case and a genocidal situation. So, for example, this incident in Bucha is exactly like Srebrenica. The whole of the war in Bosnia, by the way, wasn't a genocide, but the situation that happened in Srebrenica, where thousands were massacred, was a genocidal act and found as such by international courts. So the same could happen here. We may not say that the whole of the war in Ukraine is a genocide, but we might be able to say that certain theaters are genocidal acts like here.
Yeah, it's fascinating, but it's also so complicated, and that's why we're seeing something like this first criminal case brought after the atrocities in Darfur, like you mentioned, in the International Criminal Court, 20 years after they happened. All right, Mukesh, great to talk to you.